Soldier rescues canine German Shepherd from a swamp, almost dead. What happens next will move you to tears. He was alone, forgotten, left to die in the unforgiving swamp, his body weak, his spirit broken. Once, he had been a warrior, a K9 trained to serve and protect. But now, abandoned and barely clinging to life, his fate seemed sealed. Until one soldier heard his final cry. What happened next will leave you speechless. Stay with us until the end, because this story will move you to tears. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring more incredible and inspiring stories like this one. Now, let's dive in. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of damp earth and stagnant water clinging to everything. Sergeant James Carter wiped the sweat from his brow as he moved cautiously through the dense Louisiana swamp. The summer heat was relentless, and the buzzing of mosquitoes filled the silence. He had been out on a solo training exercise, clearing his mind after another long deployment overseas. Being in the Army for nearly a decade had hardened him, but some battles never truly left a man. The stillness of the swamp provided a rare moment of solitude, until he heard it. A faint, ragged whimper. James stopped mid-step, his muscles tensing. The sound was weak, almost swallowed by the endless croaking of frog and rustling of leaves. He turned his head, scanning the tangled mess of vines and roots. Then, he heard it again. A broken cry, barely audible but unmistakable. His heart pounded as he pushed through the thick underbrush, boots sinking into the damp ground. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but something inside him told him not to ignore it. And then he saw it. Half submerged in the mead, tangled in thick roots and covered in filth, was a German Shepherd. James's breath caught. The dog was barely alive. Ribs jutted out from its frail body. Patches of fur were missing, and its eyes, once sharp and alert no doubt, were now dull and glassy. The animal twitched weakly, its paws barely able to move. James knelt beside it, his pulse racing. A K9 unit. The remnants of a tactical harness were still strapped around its frail torso, the fabric torn and stained. This dog had once been a warrior, a partner to a soldier, just like him. "Hey, buddy," James whispered, his voice gentle but firm. "I got you." The dog let out a weak whimper, barely able to lift its head. James reached out carefully, running his fingers through the matted fur. The animal didn't flinch. It didn't have the strength to. Who had abandoned him here? Anger burned in James's chest. He had seen too many good men, and good dogs, left behind after serving their purpose. K9s were more than just animals. They were soldiers. They gave everything, and this one had been thrown away like garbage. James clenched his jaw. Not on my watch. He stripped off his gear, moving quickly but carefully. The dog was too weak to resist, as James slid his arms underneath its trembling body. It barely weighed anything. "You're coming with me," he murmured. With a deep breath, James lifted the dog into his arms. The swamp fought back, sucking at his boots with each step, but he didn't stop. He could feel the dog's rapid, shallow breathing against his chest. "Hold on, buddy. Just a little longer." The terrain was unforgiving, the mud threatening to pull them both under. James's muscles burned, but he pushed forward. He had carried fallen soldiers before. He wasn't letting this one go. But as he climbed over a tangled mess of roots, he felt it. The dog's body shuddered, then went limp. James's heart nearly stopped. "No, no, no," he muttered, tightening his grip. He quickened his pace, forcing himself to move faster, even as exhaustion threatened to slow him down. The dog's breathing was barely there now, faint puffs of air against his arm. James gritted his teeth. "Stay with me, boy." He could see the edge of the swamp now, where his truck was parked near a dirt road. Just a few more steps. With one final push, He reached solid ground, staggering toward the truck. He yanked open the door and carefully laid the dog down on the passenger seat. The animal didn't move. James's chest tightened as he pressed his fingers against the dog's ribs, searching for a heartbeat. Nothing. "Come on," he growled, shaking the dog gently. "You're not quitting on me now." Still no response. Desperation surged through him. He had seen enough death for one lifetime. He wasn't about to let it take another soldier, not when he could still fight. James pressed his hands against the dog's ribcage and started compressions. "Come on, boy. Fight." He counted, pressing firmly, but carefully. He wasn't sure if this would work, but he wasn't going to stop. "Stay with me," he repeated, his voice sharp, commanding. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a shuddering breath. The dog's chest rose, weak but steady. James let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. His hands trembled as he ran them through the dog's filthy fur. "That's it. Just breathe." The dog's eyes fluttered open, dazed, exhausted, but alive. James swallowed the lump in his throat. He wasn't just saving this dog, he was saving a fellow soldier. He reached for his keys, starting the truck. "You're not alone anymore," he murmured. "We're getting you out of here." As the engine roared to life, James made a silent promise. Whoever had abandoned this dog would regret it. And no matter what it took, he would make sure this canine had a reason to fight again. The truck's tires kicked up dust as James sped down the back road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The German Shepherd lay motionless in the passenger seat, his shallow breaths barely visible. Every few seconds, James flicked his eyes toward the dog, silently willing him to hold on. "You're gonna be okay, boy," he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. He had seen soldiers in worse shape. The look of exhaustion, of a body on the verge of giving up, it was all too familiar. But this dog had survived something brutal, and James reasoned to let his story end like this. The nearest vet clinic was almost 30 miles away. Too far. The dog might not make it that long. James reached for his phone and dialed. "Come on, pick up," he muttered, his pulse pounding in his ears. A click. Then a voice. "This better be good, Carter." James let out a breath of relief. "Doc, I need your help. Now." Dr. Ethan Miller was an Army veterinarian who had treated canine units overseas. He owed James a favor, one that James intended to cash in immediately. "How bad?" Ethan asked, his tone shifting instantly. James glanced at the dog, his chest barely rising. "Critical. Found a canine in the swamp, nearly dead. Looks like he's been out there for weeks." Ethan cursed under his breath. "Bring him to my place, I'll be ready." James didn't waste time. He floored the gas pedal, the old truck groaning in protest as it sped toward Ethan's ranch. The minutes stretched painfully long. Every so often, James reached over, resting a hand on the dog's side, reassuring himself that the shallow breathing hadn't stopped. "You're not quitting on me," he said again. "Not today." When James pulled up to Ethan's property, the vet was already outside. Medical supplies spread across a folding table. His sleeves were rolled up, his expression sharp and focused. "Let's move," Ethan said, rushing to the passenger side as James lifted the dog into his arms. The shepherd barely stirred. They carried him into Ethan's makeshift clinic, an old barn converted into a treatment space for rescue animals. The scent of antiseptic and hay filled the air as Ethan motioned for James to set the dog down on the table. Ethan worked, his trained hands assessing the damage. He checked vitals, cleaned the deep wounds, and attached an IV. "Malnourished, dehydrated, severe infection setting in," Ethan muttered, shaking his head. "Damn it, he's been through hell." James crossed his arms, jaw clenched. "Can you save him?" Ethan met his eyes. "I'll try, but he's weak. He needs a reason to fight. James stepped closer to the table, resting a hand gently on the dog's head. The fur was coarse, matted with mud, but beneath all that was a soldier, a fighter. "He's got one," James said firmly. Ethan nodded, then got to work. He administered antibiotics, cleaned out wounds, and started fluids. The shepherd twitched slightly, but didn't wake. "Does he have a name?" Ethan asked. James shook his head. "Not one I know of," Ethan sighed. "If he makes it, he'll need one." James didn't respond. The dog had to make it. For nearly an hour, Ethan worked. James didn't leave the dog's side, watching his shallow breaths, willing them to grow stronger. Then, finally, the shepherd let out a weak, broken whimper. James's chest tightened. It was small, barely a sound, but it was something. "He's fighting," Ethan murmured. "That's a good sign." James exhaled, his shoulders relaxing for the first time all night. This dog wasn't just a survivor, he was a warrior, and James would make sure he had the chance to fight again. The barn was quiet, except for the steady hum of the IV and the occasional soft exhale from the wounded canine. James sat on an old wooden stool beside the treatment table, arms resting on his knees, eyes locked on the dog's frail body. He had been in this position before, too many times, sitting next to dying soldiers, waiting for a sign, praying they'd pull through. But this was different. This dog had been left for dead. Someone had abandoned him. James had seen plenty of war dogs in his time, but none that had suffered like this one. The question haunted him. Who had done this? And why? Ethan leaned against the counter, wiping his hands with a towel. "He's stable for now," he said, "but the next 24 hours will tell us if he's gonna make it." James nodded, his gaze never leaving the dog. "He's a fighter." Ethan sighed. "Yeah, but even fighters need a reason to keep going." James reached out, running his hand gently over the shepherd's head. The dog barely reacted, but his ears twitched slightly. A tiny movement, but enough to tell James he wasn't gone yet. "You think he was military?" Ethan asked, nodding toward the torn tactical harness James had set aside. James studied it. The fabric was ripped, the lettering faded. No visible identification, no tags, nothing. "If he was," James muttered, "someone sure as hell didn't take care of him." Ethan folded his arms. "Dogs like this don't just end up in a swamp on their own, James. He was dumped." James clenched his jaw. He had seen soldiers left behind, forgotten once they weren't useful anymore. But a canine? "Not on my watch," he muttered. Ethan watched him for a moment, then sighed. "You're keeping him, aren't you?" James exhaled. He hadn't even thought about it, but now that the words were out there, he realized there was no other option. "Yeah," he said. "I guess I am." Ethan smirked. "Figures." James leaned closer to the dog. "But first, he needs a name." Ethan wiped his hands on a rag. He had one before. You just don't know what it was. James studied the shepherd's face, the deep scars, the strength still hidden beneath the frailty. This dog had been through war. Then it hit him. "Shadow," James murmured. Ethan raised a brow. "Shadow?" James nodded. "Yeah. He survived in the dark, got left behind, and still made it out. He's a damn shadow." Ethan chuckled. "Fitting." James smirked, looking down at the dog. "What do you think, boy? You like that?" For the first time, Shadow's eyes fluttered open. Just a sliver, but enough for James to see a faint flicker of life in them. The dog let out a weak, barely audible sound. James grinned. "Yeah, I think he likes it." Hours passed. Shadow didn't move much, but his breathing was stronger. The fluids were working. The antibiotics were fighting the infection. Ethan stepped outside to take a call, leaving James alone with the dog. James adjusted in his seat. His body ached from exhaustion, but he didn't care. He wasn't leaving. He thought about the war zones he had been in, the K9 units he had seen in action, the bond between a handler and his dog. Had Shadow had a handler? Had someone loved him once? A sudden sharp exhale from Shadow made James look down. The shepherd's paws twitched slightly, his breathing becoming uneven. A nightmare. James knew it well. He had them too. He reached out and placed a firm, steadying lato on Shadow's side. "Easy, B," he murmured. "You're safe now." Shadow's breathing slowed, his body relaxed. James swallowed hard. This dog had been abandoned, left to suffer, left to die. But not anymore. Whoever had thrown him away had made a mistake. Because Shadow wasn't alone anymore, and James wasn't about to let him go. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks of the barn, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. James sat exactly where he had been all night, on the stool beside Shadow, his fingers absently running through the shepherd's thick fur. The dog was still weak, but his breathing was steady now, his body no longer trembling with exhaustion. Shadow was fighting. James had seen men give up before. He had watched strong soldiers lose the will to keep going, their eyes hollow from too many battles. But Shadow hadn't quit, even when his body had been pushed to the edge. That meant something. The barn door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He took one look at James and smirked. "You didn't sleep." James exhaled through his nose. Didn't want to leave him. Ethan shook his head, but didn't argue. Instead, he walked over and checked the IV, watching as the fluid slowly dripped into Shadow's veins. "He's holding on," Ethan said, his voice softer now, stronger than I expected. James nodded. "Told you. He's a fighter." Ethan gave him a knowing look. "Yeah. Wonder where he learned that from." James ignored the comment, but Ethan wasn't wrong. Maybe that's why he had found Shadow. Two soldiers, both carrying too many scars, both left behind in different ways. Shadow stirred slightly, his tail twitching just a fraction. James felt a small rush of relief at the movement. "He's gonna need rehab," Ethan continued, moving around the barn. "His muscles are weak, and that infection took a toll on him. But if you keep him on the right track, he could recover fully." James ran a hand over his face. "I'll do whatever it takes." Ethan paused, watching him. "You already made up your mind about keeping him, huh?" James glanced down at Shadow, at the way the dog's body had relaxed in his presence, as if he knew he was safe now. "I don't think it was ever a choice," James admitted. "He's mine, and I'm his." Ethan smiled slightly. "Then, let's get to work." 2 days passed, and Shadow slowly regained his strength. He was still weak, still unable to stand on his own for long, but his eyes were brighter now. The dull, lifeless stare had been replaced with something new. Hope. James worked with him constantly, feeding him small amounts of food, helping him stretch his legs, talking to him like he was an old friend, and in return, Shadow started responding. The first time James saw the shepherd wag his tail, even just a little, something in his chest tightened. This dog wanted to live. But James knew there was still something missing. Shadow's past. Where had he come from? Who had trained him? And more importantly, who had left him for dead? James sat outside the barn that evening, watching as Shadow rested on a blanket, the soft breeze ruffling his fur. The shepherd had improved, but James wasn't done. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in a while. A gruff voice answered after 3 rings. "Carter?" James leaned back against the barn wall. "I need a favor, Daniels." Silence. Then, "What kind of favor?" James glanced at Shadow, who lifted his head slightly at the sound of his voice. "A K9, James said. Found him half dead in a swamp. No ID, no tags, but he was definitely military." Daniels exhaled sharply. "Shit." "You sure?" "Yeah," James said. "And I need to know where he came from." There was another pause, then the sound of a keyboard clicking. "I'll dig," Daniels said. "Might take some time, though." "I'm not going anywhere," James replied. When he hung up, he looked back at Shadow. The shepherd had closed his eyes again, his body finally relaxed after days of pain. Someone had left him behind, and James was going to find out who. Because whoever had abandoned Shadow had made one critical mistake. They had left him alive. And now, James wasn't letting go. The night air was cool as James sat on the porch of Ethan's barn, his phone resting on his knee. Shadow lay beside him on a soft blanket, his breathing steady, his head resting on his paws. The dog was still weak, but every day he showed more signs of life. James had spent hours feeding him, helping him stand, stretching out his muscles. The shepherd's strength was returning slowly, but his spirit had already begun to heal. He no longer looked like a ghost of a soldier left behind. The phone vibrated. James picked it up immediately. Daniel's voice came through, low and serious. "I found something." James sat up straighter. "Talk to me." There was a pause, then the sound of papers shuffling. The dog's name was K9 Shadow, part of a military unit deployed overseas, highly trained, used for search and rescue, explosives detection, the whole deal. James's chest tightened. What happened to his handler? Daniels sighed. "That's the thing, Carter. His handler was killed in action 6 months ago. Shadow was injured during the same operation." James swallowed hard, glancing at the dog lying next to him. Shadow had lost more than just his strength. He had lost his partner. After the handler died, Shadow was sent back to the States, Daniels continued. "But here's where it gets bad. The military placed him in a transition program, supposed to be rehabilitated and adopted out." James's grip on the phone tightened. "And?" Daniels hesitated. "Somehow, he never made it to a new home. The paperwork shows that Shadow was picked up by a private security contractor, a company called Blackridge Solutions. But after that, nothing. No records, no reports. He just disappeared." James clenched his jaw. "And you think they dumped him?" Daniels let out a low breath. "Wouldn't be the first time, Carter. These companies use ex-military dogs for private security jobs. But when the dogs aren't useful anymore, they get thrown away," James finished, his voice like steel. His blood boiled. Shadow had served his country. He had lost his handler, suffered injuries, and instead of being given a home, he had been discarded like trash. James looked down at the shepherd. Shadow lifted his head slightly, meeting his gaze with tired but intelligent eyes. James had always believed in loyalty. Soldiers never left their own behind. And yet, Shadow had been abandoned. Not anymore. "You still there?" Daniels asked. "Yeah," James said, his voice low. "I need names. Whoever left him to die, I want to know who they are." Daniels exhaled. "I'll see what I can dig up." James hung up and ran a hand through his short-cropped hair. His mind was racing, fury tightening his chest. Shadow had been betrayed, and James wasn't going to let them get away with it. The next morning, Ethan found James and Shadow outside the barn, the shepherd attempting to stand on his own. Ethan raised a brow. "You're pushing him hard." James didn't look away from the dog. "He can take it." Shadow wobbled but held his ground. His muscles trembled from the effort, but James could see it in his eyes. He was fighting. "Come on, buddy," James encouraged. "You got this." Shadow let out a small huff of breath, then took a step. James grinned. "That's it. Ethan shook his head with a smirk. You're stubborn as hell, Carter. James glanced at him. So is he? Ethan folded his arms. So, what now? James looked down at Shadow, who was still standing, his body weak but his determination stronger than ever. Now, James said, his voice cold with resolve. We find out who did this to him. Shadow lifted his head, his ears perking slightly at the sound of James's voice. And for the first time since they had met, James saw fire in the dog's eyes. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for justice. The morning sun cast long shadows over Ethan's ranch as James knelt beside Shadow, working his muscles with slow, deliberate motions. The shepherd had made progress, but his legs were still weak, his body still recovering from months of neglect. But the fire in his eyes, that was stronger than ever. You're getting there, buddy, James murmured, running his hand along Shadow's side. The dog let out a low huff, shifting his weight, determined to stand a little longer than yesterday. James smiled. Good. Keep fighting. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing Daniel's name flash across the screen. Tell me you've got something, James said as he answered. Daniels didn't waste time. I found the guy who dumped Shadow. James stood, his muscles tensing. Who? Name's Logan Pierce, Daniels said. Ex-military, now working as head of field operations for Black Ridge Solutions. He was responsible for Shadow's transition, but instead of making sure he got adopted, he signed off on disposing of him. James's blood ran cold. Disposed. Like garbage. Where is he now? James asked, his voice dangerously calm. Daniels hesitated. James? Where? Daniels sighed. Black Ridge headquarters, downtown Houston. James clenched his jaw. Send me the address. A pause, then. Carter, don't do anything stupid. James exhaled sharply. No promises. He hung up and turned to Ethan, who had been listening from the porch. You're going after him, Ethan said, more statement than question. James nodded. Yeah. Ethan ran a hand over his face. You sure that's a good idea? James looked down at Shadow. The shepherd was watching him, ears pricked forward, as if he understood exactly what was happening. That dog didn't get justice, James said. And I don't let my own get left behind. Ethan sighed. Then I guess you're taking him with you. James smirked. Wouldn't have it any other way. That evening, James loaded Shadow into his truck, the shepherd settling into the passenger seat like he belonged there. His body was still weak, but his eyes were alert, his focus sharp. James rested a hand on the dog's head. Let's go, partner. Shadow let out a soft grunt, then turned his gaze toward the road. As James pulled onto the highway, heading straight for Houston, one thing was certain. Logan Pierce had no idea what was coming for him. The Houston skyline glowed against the night sky as James parked his truck a block away from Black Ridge Solutions headquarters. The building loomed ahead, tinted windows, security cameras on every corner, and a parking lot filled with high-end vehicles. It was the kind of place built for men who thought they were untouchable. James clenched his jaw. Logan Pierce was one of those men. Beside him, Shadow sat alert in the passenger seat, his body still weak, but his instincts sharp. His ears flicked forward, his gaze locked onto the building, as if he already knew what was inside. James turned to him. You ready for this? Shadow let out a quiet huff. James smirked. Yeah, me too. He reached for his phone and dialed Daniels. You at the location? Daniels answered immediately. Yeah, James said. Tell me you've got an update. Daniels sighed. Pierce is in his office, top floor. You thinking of walking right in? James glanced at Shadow, then back at the building. Something like that. Daniels groaned. Carter, Listen to me. Blackridge isn't just some shady security firm. These guys have lawyers, connections, and enough money to bury problems. If you walk in there swinging, you're going to end up in a cell or worse. James exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. Then, I'll make sure I don't get caught. Daniels cursed under his breath. I swear, man. One of these days, James hung up. He reached over and opened the passenger door. Shadow jumped down, landing with a slight wobble, but he steadied himself. The shepherd lifted his head, eyes locked on the building. Let's go, James muttered. They moved through the shadows, slipping past the security cameras, keeping low as they reached the side entrance. James had spent years in the military. Stealth was second nature. But Shadow? Shadow was trained for this. The dog moved beside him, silent and precise, like a ghost in the night. James tested the side door. Locked. He pulled out a small multi-tool from his pocket, working quickly on the keypad. Within seconds, the door clicked open. They slipped inside. The building was quiet. The halls empty except for the occasional security guard making his rounds. James kept close to the walls, moving toward the stairwell. Shadow followed, his breathing steady, his ears alert. The old shepherd wasn't at full strength, but something in him had switched. His body might have been recovering, but his instincts were razor sharp. They climbed to the top floor, moving through the dimly lit corridors. Pierce's office was at the end of the hall. James stopped just outside the door, listening. A voice, muffled but clear. He reached for the handle, unlocked. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Logan Pierce sat at his desk, talking on the phone. The moment he saw James, his expression shifted from confusion to irritation. Who the hell? Then his eyes landed on Shadow, and everything changed. Pierce went pale. His hand trembled as he set the phone down. No, that's not possible. James took another step forward. Surprised? Pierce's nyemas flicked between James and Shadow. That dog was supposed to be dead, James finished for him. Pierce swallowed hard. Listen, you don't understand. James slammed his hands onto the desk. I understand plenty. Shadow let out a low, dangerous growl. Pierce flinched. James leaned in, his voice like steel. You left him to die. Pierce shook his head. It wasn't my decision. James narrowed his eyes. But you signed the order. Silence. James exhaled sharply. K9 units don't get discarded like trash. They serve. They save lives. And you? You threw him away. Pierce opened his mouth, but James cut him off. You're going to fix it. Pierce blinked. What? James straightened, crossing his arms. I don't care how many connections you have. You're going to make this right. That means clearing his records, making sure he gets the recognition he deserves, and giving me full ownership. Pierce hesitated. And if I don't? James smirked. Then I make sure the world knows exactly what you did. And I guarantee you, Blackridge won't survive the fallout. Pierce paled further. He glanced at Shadow again. The dog was standing strong now, his head high, his eyes locked onto the man who had abandoned him. Pierce licked his lips. Fine. James nodded. Smart choice. Pierce tapped his keyboard, pulling up the necessary files. It's done, he muttered. The dog's yours. James didn't bother thanking him. He turned to Shadow. Come on, buddy. Let's go home. Shadow hesitated. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, right past James, and growled directly in Pierce's face. A warning. A reminder. Pierce swallowed hard, sweat forming at his temple. Shadow turned and walked back to James's side, standing tall. James gave Pierce one last look. If I ever hear about another K9 being left behind, I'll be back." Then he and Shadow walked out the door, leaving Pierce in stunned silence. Outside, James took a deep breath of the cool night air. Shadow sat beside him, his tail thumping against the ground. James crouched, running a hand down the shepherd's back. "You did good, buddy." Shadow let out a small huff. Then, for the first time, he nudged James's hand with his nose. Trust. Bond. A new beginning. James smiled. "Come on, let's go home." Shadow followed him to the truck, jumping into the passenger seat like he belonged there. Because he did. Because he had always belonged. And now, he was finally home.